Okay, so the final stage of the respiratory pathway, the electron transport chain. This is basically where the ATP gets made. Okay. So where does it happen? It happens on the inner mitochondrial membrane, and the purpose is to release the energy that is stored in the hydrogen carriers through oxidizing them, and then using that to form ATP. How does it do this? Well, in the membrane, there are a series of proteins. So that inner mitochondrial membrane is studded with these special electron and hydrogen carrier proteins, and they undergo redox reactions to pass protons and electrons along the chain. And in doing so, they release energy. Okay, so let me demonstrate using this slightly simplified model. So if we take protein 1, if that is oxidized, okay, so oxidation is loss, okay, then what that can do is it can then reduce protein 2. So oxidation is loss, so that's going to release an electron or a protein, and then reduction is gain, so that's then going to gain that electron or proton, okay? Then protein 2 would then be oxidized, and protein 3 would be reduced, and then the electron or the proton would move from protein 2 to protein 3, okay? Now, as this happens, and this is what happens, we're moving from a high energy protein 1 to a low energy protein 3. So basically, as the electrons or the protons are being passed from protein 1 to protein 2 to protein 3, they're losing energy. A little bit like if you bounced a ball down the stairs, as the ball goes down the stairs, it is actually losing a little bit of energy. Now, what that energy is then used to do is that if all of these are embedded on a membrane, which they are, then what happens is that that energy is used to pump protons across that membrane. And if you think about the structure of a mitochondria, so we're on the inner mitochondrial membrane here. So what's happening is protons are being pumped from the matrix to the intermembrane space. And so you're getting a proton gradient building up in this intermembrane space, and that becomes important later on. Okay. So, as I said, the result is that the protons, the hydrogen ions, get pumped across the membrane into the intermembrane space. Here's a kind of a more formal picture again from our friend Mr. BioNinja. And what we can see is that the electron, which originally comes from reduced NAD, is passed from proton 1, 2, it wiggles its way along, and in the meantime, hydrogen ions are being pumped across the membrane. Okay, it requires energy because you're actually going against a concentration gradient here. Okay, so how on earth does that make ATP? Well, that's a pretty good question. So we've got our proteins embedded in this membrane, and protons are now coming through into this intermembrane space. Now, one of the adaptations of a mitochondria is that it's got a relatively small volume, so you generate a concentration gradient really quickly. So the concentration of protons is really high in the intermembrane space and it's low in the matrix. So the protons actually want to return to the matrix, but they can't because this membrane is impermeable to hydrogen ions. What do you know, though? There is a specialized protein which allows the hydrogen ions to move through it. So here we have our protons, and they're going to come through this special protein channel. Now, this special protein channel, you can see I've drawn it as a kind of it looks a bit like a lollipop in 3D, okay? And basically, as the proteins come through this, this rotates, okay? Now, if I was to do a bird's eye view of the head of this lollipop, they're often called stalked particles, okay? It's kind of divided into three, basically, and you've got one site which has ADP and P. You've got one site which then has ATP, and you've got one site which is an entry-exit point. So what happens is as these heads rotate, what we're doing is we are turning ADP and P into ATP. And because in this head is an enzyme called ATP synthase or synthetase. Okay, it takes 3 hydrogen ions to produce 1 ATP, and that process is called chemiosmosis. So essentially the generation of energy by the movement of hydrogen ions, and that is called chemiosmosis. All right, so what about the water? If we go back to our overview of respiration, glucose plus oxygen goes to form 6 carbon dioxides and 6 waters. Well, we've made our carbon dioxides, we haven't yet made any water. So how do we make the water? Well, we use the oxygen, which we also haven't used yet, as the final electron or proton acceptor, and it becomes reduced to form water. So here we have our electron transport chain. Hydrogen ions being pumped across here. They then come back through the membrane, and then they go and they join on, and at the very end of the electron transport chain you're going to have oxygen. The electrons from the electron transport chain are going to join with it. The hydrogens which come through the stalked particles, rotate them to form ATP, are also going to join, and that's going to make our water. And so that's how we end up with water. So it's kind of fun to think about how many ATP are made. Basically, 1 reduced NAD will result in 9 protons crossing the membrane, whereas 1 FAD will result in 6. And 3 protons going the other way makes 1 ATP. So 1 NAD will result in 3 ATP, and 1 FAD will result in 2 ATP. We had 10 NAD, so that makes 30 ATP. We had 2 FAD, so that makes 4. So through oxidative phosphorylation, we make 34 ATP, which we can add to the 4 from substrate level phosphorylation to make a theoretical yield of 38 ATP per glucose molecule. Now, the reality is that you probably won't get as many as 38 ATP in total, because there'll be sort of energy losses along the way, but that is the maximum theoretical yield.